While initially believed to be stripped of all of its lore, Nightreign represents a shift back to a storytelling first seen in the early days of Dark Souls. Snippets of lore derived from scattered memories and item descriptions blended together to not only make the world of Elden Ring more whole, but providing a deep story too. The Nightfarers are admittedly the most obvious aspects of the lore in the game, so let's go over the story of each Nightfarer together. Wylder's story is intimately related to the story of the enigmatic priestess, later known to us as the playable Duchess. We learn from Duchess's own story, Wylder comes from a distant land filled with green pastures. One day upon the Nightreign, Wylder would set off for the lands between, his first journal entry suggesting he felt this unwavering affinity to do so due to an heirloom of his lost sister, an earring. While he assumed this longing was associated to defeating the Night Lord, it becomes apparent during his time there this longing was associated to the earring pulling him towards the goal of finding his sister and preserving her own life tied down to the Night Lord's presence. In this journey described as treacherous, he would become afflicted with a grievous wound, a chronic condition that would eventually cost him his own life in due time. After making his way to the lands between successfully and joining the Nightfarers of the Round Table Hold, he was swiftly dutied with eliminating the Night Lord and bringing an end to the Nightreign for good. The Duchess's second journal entry outlines these events, proclaiming his unparalleled mastery of swords and his role within the Round Table as essential for success. As Wylder accustomed himself to the Hold, he would also familiarise himself with the caretaker of the Hold known as the Iron Menial, a marionette of sentience. The Iron Menial requests of Wylder the procurement of a whetstone to help fortify equipment, a task that would eventually have him in good favour with the Iron Menial, enough so that he would offer up any of his wares to Wylder. Upon choosing a mended earring placed upon the Iron Menial's workstation, the Iron Menial immediately suggests he did not mean to offer this to Wylder as it was for the Duchess. However, Wylder in this moment knew full well the earring on the workstation matched perfectly the earring that once drew him to the Round Table Hold, and thus asked to borrow it. Once borrowed, Wylder can raise both earrings against the light and reminisce his history with his sister, making clear the Duchess is in fact his sister. This is reaffirmed for Wylder through the Duchess's story too, particularly regarding the interaction related to Wylder offering up some pita bread to the Duchess eating the food with great joy and mutually reminiscing her own childhood too. Wylder, now aware the Duchess is his sister, finds out very quickly his sister's life is tied down to the Round Table Hold, which in itself is tied down to the Nightreign, and thus once the Nightreign is over, the Hold is no more, meaning the Duchess too will be no more. Fearing the consequence, Wylder would re-navigate his plans and seek a means to preserve the Duchess's life, and upon querying the Iron Menial would come to the possession of a silver tear, an object that allows him to transfer his life force to be reborn anew, a concept that would spur upon Wylder a plan to have them live eternally in the same plane of existence. This would spur him in the final sequence to transfer his dying body's life force and be born anew into the body of the Night Lord Helster, who commanded the Nightreign, duly preserving his own life but also maintaining the Night Lord's presence and thus keeping the Duchess alive too, ensuring their lives were now bonded for eternity. Leading us perfectly to the Duchess. As we learn, both the Duchess and Wylder were related, their childhood shared. She too originated from the grassy distant lands far apart from the lands between. We learn from the Duchess and the description of the pita bread, they descended from a nomadic tribe. However, the Duchess herself may have left her homeland much time before her brother. Her recounting of the events related to the War of Shattering and the aftermath of the absence of a formal order taking root suggests she may have been driven here by grace during or prior to the Shattering War, eventually being naturalized as a keeper to the Round Table Hold itself to ensure the efforts against the Nightreign undoing the entirety of the remnants of the Golden Order and the Erdtree were seen to. We know smithing master Hugh was also bound to the Round Table Hold as a smith, his story too related to his duty to the Golden Order, the Greater Will and Marika specifically. The Duchess makes countless references to a being known as the Formless Master. Theories as to who this is are purely speculative at the moment and may refer to the Greater Will itself, as the Duchess seems extremely favourable in the Executor storyline related to renewing the Golden Erdtree. As more information from the countless item descriptions enter the game, this can be made much clearer. Regardless, what we do know is during her time prior or adjacent to the Shattering, she would find a stepfather of royalty. Royalty in the days prior to the Shattering related entirely to the bureaucratized power sanctioned by Leyndell. For example, the Morai family of the Shaded Castle, and even the Carrion royal family after the union between Radagon and Rennala. Now bound to the Round Table Hold, her past has become foggy even to herself, something recounted by a journal entry detailing a letter from the Iron Menial to the Duchess directly. The Iron Menial sought nothing more than to aid the Duchess in bringing the Nightfarers an audience with the Night Lord and defeating him to settle the darkness that was washing away the history of the Lands Between. While initially the Duchess was ready to enact this duty, she faces a cruel moral quandary on her brother's arrival and his dire state, as upon looking for a means to keep him alive, the Iron Menial suggests the only means to do so would be to supplant Wylder's soul into a vessel. It reads, to make such a thing possible to connect the Wylder in the outside world before he draws any closer to death, we require a fetish. The fetish of course being Helster, the Night Lord himself. However, at the final moment of her remembrance, her journal reads a final message to the Iron Menial, which proposes a solution for both. It reads, to a dear friend who has always been true, please follow the blessed bond and safeguard my brother's life. To this end, we must first lay the Night Lord to rest. We need not sacrifice one goal for the other. We can achieve both. Asking the Iron Menial to aid her brother in supplanting his soul in the Night Lord after the original Night Lord is already killed. Essentially fulfilling her role in aiding in the defeat of the Night Lord, but simultaneously saving her brother's life by supplanting his soul into it. This is precisely why the Iron Menial is so eager to teach Wylder of the presence of a Silver Tear and affirms his position of being reborn as Helster himself, something that the Iron Menial is initially reluctant to divulge, but eventually goes on to even relay specific instructions to Wylder in obtaining and using it. This brings the Duchess's story to a close. What the events of Wylder taking on Helster's form does for the Duchess's life and the Round Table Hold is never spoken of, but from Wylder's final journal entry we are given a clue. It reads, in his tribe, when one warrior gave such a gift to another, it was a promise to ever fight side by side, whether separated by land or sea. Did his young sister remember such customs? He pinned a brooch to his coat, as was their practice, and gently placed his hand upon it. Once we're done, it'll be goodbye. He knew the twin horses would never run free again as they once did side by side, but perhaps just one could gallop onward. Suggesting while they will no longer ride side by side as they are now in dutiful opposition to one another, at least the Duchess can gallop onwards with her life assured both have preserved in this world. However, the end of the Duchess's and Wylder's story are not the only questlines that prolong the premise of the game itself, leading us to the lore of Iron. While initially his past is hard to place, aside from the details that he originated from a band of mercenaries known as the Fellowship, we learn quickly that the Fellowship were no ordinary band of mercenaries, but beings that lived in death. As a recap to Elden Ring, living in death is the state beings assume after being afflicted by the curse mark. This state ensures their bodies cannot truly die. Dying in the world of Elden Ring has been a transformative concept. The earliest forms of death in Elden Ring are told to relate to the times before Marika's rule, where deathbirds would usher dead beings into an afterlife through a death rite ritual, a ceremonial burning of their physical bodies. However, after Marika defeated the Gloam-Eyed Queen, a being that claimed the power of destined death, she would create her new order absent of this rune, and thus death in its traditional form was no longer governed by the Deathbirds and their associated god, the Twin Birds. Instead of dying, all beings were now in a consistent cycle of rebirth, their material bodies absorbed by the ground and the roots of the Erd Tree, ready to be reborn again under Marika's order. This was one of Marika's key pillars in creating an immortal and perfect order. However, the Rune of Death, while excluded from the Order itself, still remained in the hands of her shadowbound beast, Malekith. However, one day Malekith's Rune of Death would be skillfully stolen and later used to murder Marika's supposed heir, Godwyn the Golden. However, the assailants who murdered Godwyn while using Destined Death were only able to rip apart his soul from his body, leaving his material body to endlessly decay, corrupting the very roots and soil of the Erd Tree. This meant many beings upon their death would be absorbed by the corrupted roots of the Erd Tree, unable to be reborn under the Golden Order, and were instead reborn under Godwyn's decaying corpse. These reborn beings were no longer graced by the Erd Tree, rather cursed by Godwyn the once golden, and now the Prince of Death, his body now representative of a new order entirely. This curse would create those who live in death. While initial theories suggested those who live in death were to be labelled as vacuous, wandering, and incoherent bodies, we learn from the Death Knight's fear and now the Fellowship that they were in fact quite sentient and saw their forms as not a curse, rather a new way of being, and thus their persecution by the Golden Order as inherently oppressive. The Fellowship likely emerged during this period due to their unparalleled ability to conduct assassinations. Essentially, they were relentless and immortal, and understood death better than any other being, as having likely experienced it many times over themselves. Eventually, in the world after the Shattering, the Fellowship would lose a key figure in their ranks known as the Traitor, as he would abandon them for the Lands Between. The Fellowship would develop the moniker for him, as Ionai's first journal entry reads of his abandonment linked closely to the destruction of their base of operations in the Duscan Valley. This is where Ionai enters the picture. The Fellowship would recruit Ionai to find the traitor and bring justice to his actions by eliminating him. They ask of Ionai to follow his trail towards the Lands Between. Once he enters the Lands Between, it's likely the fog associated with the region would have him slowly losing his memory, not unlike the Duchess and Wylder. In the Round Table Hold, and without remembering his true purpose, he would join the ranks of the Nightfarers, the priestess seeing within Ionai the talent of a killer who knows death all too well. However, we quickly learn from the priestess that Ionai was not the first of the Fellowship to arrive, as she tells us she also knew of this so-called traitor and how he was the first of the Fellowship to join the Round Table Hold as a Nightfarer. This specific thread would eventually lead back to Ionai, where he would remember his purpose as to why he came here in the first place. This, of course, being the death of the traitor, something reinforced by the priestess, as she too saw him as a traitor, not to the Fellowship but to the Round Table Hold, as he not only abandoned the Fellowship but also abandoned the Nightfarers too. As we encounter the traitor and speak to him in the crypts back at the Round Table Hold, Ionai learns quickly exactly why the traitor not only left for the Lands Between, but why he left the Nightfarers too, as he would likely learn of the Golden Order's persecution of those that live in death, and the prospect that if the Nightreign is to end, the Golden Order may re-emerge only to recodify their oppression. The traitor saw to it that the Nightreign reigned evermore. The darkness was not to be seen as antithetical to their being, but an indictment of a civilization that continually oppressed them, refocusing his efforts and murdering Nightfarers so that the Night Lords could rule evermore. The traitor ends his dialogue to Ionai, telling us we are in fact no different to him. We live in death, and thus we too will benefit from the Nightreign's continuation. Ionai, now with a newfound perspective of both the traitor's treachery to the Fellowship, but also to the nature of the Nightreign, eventually makes the decision to prolong the Nightreign too, as after the final sequence is concluded, Ionai can be granted his own ending sequence by murdering the vessel that binds the Round Table Hold, and allowing for the Nightreign to continue its erasure of the Golden Order that persecuted his kin. The Guardian story, while new to the Elden Ring timeline, may actually find itself related to a piece of lore related to the main game. The first murmurs of the existence of a winged folk come from the events surrounding Stormveil Castle and the existence of a Storm Ruler, a being that controlled the skies and ruled Limgrave. We're told the Storm people were proud and defensive, so much so that it would take Godfrey's direct efforts to overthrow the Storm ruler in his quest to unify the lands between. We're told Godfrey was so impressed by their control of the winds, he would harness their power and adopt the Stormhawks and Knights of their realm into his own. While the Guardian and thus his race known as the Pinion Folk are never spoken of, it's likely they share descendancy with the Storm people, as both harboured the ability to control the winds. We're told the Pinions in particular lived far to the west of the lands between, a place known as the Winged Realm. Their culture is consistently described by the journal entries concerning the Old Flock as entirely homogeneous. They would soar across the skies as if they were one living organism, empowered by their unique ability to control the storm in unison. The culture of these people was one bound by duty in the preservation of their land, which was especially important as these lands are described as hosting many contentious factions, but most notably a place known as the Deep Woods. Journal entry 3 tells us of a pivotal moment in the Pinion Folk's history. Engaged in a war, they began their siege on a citadel. The citadel initially bore no chance at victory. The flock of Pinion Folk easily navigated their hails of spears, descending towards the enemy and claiming the upper hand very quickly. The flock in unison coordinated a winning plan until a new weapon would emerge from within the citadel, something described initially as cursed blades. A weapon sown with the power to remove the Pinion Folk's most powerful and strategically significant traits, their flight. It reads, "Knights of the Pinion Folk feared not death, as it was their duty and their pride to give themselves for the sake of the whole. The flock would always grow new feathers. But with ease it was that the cursed blades stole from the flock their wholeness and unity, by instilling in them the fear of losing their flight." As soon as the cursed blades were unleashed, the Pinion Folk began to die one after the other, and we are told from the 5th chapter of the journal that the Guardian was the sole survivor in this war, clutching at his own life and fleeing to retain the Pinion Folk's legacy. At some point, the Guardian, as the final surviving member of his people, would make his way east to the Round Table Hold, finding within the Round Table the Nightfarers and something he described as his new flock, taking specific fondness to the Recluse, a witch of a solitary nature. Through his storyline, the Guardian acts as a great narrative piece on the usual happenings of the Round Table Hold, keeping tabs of all other Nightfarers and referring to them endearingly in his journal, once again representing his kind and inclusive nature. But between the joy remained a burden of guilt as to his inability to protect his old flock, something that spurs within him an inquiry into what exactly happened during that fateful day. Collaborating with the Iron Menial, he would gather a variety of tomes and learn that it was, in fact, the Recluse, his comrade and a member of his new flock, that was responsible for the creation of these cursed weapons, now known to us as the Ictarus, a weapon imbued with a power once used to quell the storms, later militarized by the Recluse to use directly against the Pinion Folk to clip them of their wings forever. Facing a difficult decision, the Guardian confronts the witch, his story ending on the option of two choices: to punish the Recluse for her past misdeeds, avenging the old flock, or to forgive the Recluse, choosing to move on from his past, and instilling in his new flock the traits that once made the Pinion Folk one of the most powerful and just groups in the world. I'd like to think canonically the Guardian chose the latter for his ending, as it fits his character far more. Fittingly moving us on to the Recluse. Immediately, the Recluse is very different to all other Nightfarers. She, unlike her contemporaries, seems to retain her memory and thus has come to the lands between, retaining from the very beginning her true purpose as to why she is here. We learn quickly from her journal entries that she is looking for an infant, and not just any ordinary infant, but her own infant, a being she is told to have once given birth to. However, we know well in Elden Ring, seldom is birth related to the usual procedures of procreation. Rather, much like Melania's children in the Kindred of Rot, truly divine beings are often birthed from one's infusion with a greater force. This becomes relevant as we quickly learn her infant was closer to a god than a human. Its early days, while still under the supervision of the Recluse, were marked with an insatiable hunger. Eating almost anything offered to it, we learn eventually the Recluse would employ her friend and contemporary, the Witch of the Wheel, to nurse the infant. Only one day the infant would grow and begin to consume far more than it was offered, turning on its nurse, consuming the Witch of the Wheel and an army of men that would seek to subdue the being, eventually consuming them too and fleeing. Chapter 5 of the Recluse's journal tells us it fled that day, and a hunch suggests the infant had sought an audience with the Night Lord. The Recluse in the same entry feels a burden of guilt for this occurring, suggesting it was her surgical handling of the infant that is accountable for its rage, arguing things may have been different if she had embraced the child more lovingly from the offset. As her research into where her infant had fled to within Limveld progresses, she comes across a notable item, this being the Night Shard and the Vestige of the Night. The Vestige of the Night is located once we bring the Iron Menial a Shard of Night. He suggests the object may point the Recluse in the right direction regarding the whereabouts of her infant, and in fact it does, leading us to a bed where we can find the Vestige of the Night. This item describes the former presence of the Night Lord himself. Upon gaining the item, we can even hear a faint crying emanating from the bed, informing us whatever happened to the infant, its whereabouts are entirely connected to the Night Lord himself. The following event has us confronting the previously deceased Witch of the Wheel, who proclaims her rebirth accountable to the power of the infant. Immediately, the Recluse and even many members of the community rush to suggest the Night Lord is thus the infant. However, even the Iron Menial suggests the issue is far more complicated than that when we relay this information to him. He then offers us an item bestowed upon him in a dream by the Night Lord himself, this being the bone-like stone. It tells us this is a physical bone of an outer god with the quote, power to expunge the divine essence but can also be destroyed by the same essence. It's within this we actually get the more obvious clue as to where the infant is, and more importantly, what the infant is. The infant is an outer god birthed through a ritual invoked by the Recluse to bring upon a child that bear its form, exactly in the same way Millicent was born from Melania and the outer god of Scarlet Rot. However, unlike Millicent, the infant was born of an outer god that feasted and grew on the consumption of the divine, consuming it all and leaving everything so lightless they were unable to even cast a shadow. This therefore draws the timeline as to why the Night Lord's presence can be found where we should have found the infant, as the Night Lord more than likely took this aspect of an outer god to create a new order of darkness. The infant was the god, and the Night Lord, originally known as Hailster, was the consort. While this theory may seem far-fetched, the description of the bone-like stone explains the Nightreign phenomena. Why else would a rain beset the lands between that would consume the very life force of the Golden Order, draining it of its light and leaving behind not even a shadow as it burned its way through? The game from the very opening cutscene describes the events of the Nightreign as a force erasing the history of the Golden Order, consuming as it drew closer, not unlike the infant as it was consuming the life force of countless army men and even the Witch of the Wheel. Hailster essentially kidnapped this infant to use it as a god to begin a new order violently antithetical to the Golden Order. If that isn't enough evidence, when we kill the Night Lord, we can return to the very bed Hailster once kidnapped the infant. There it lies crying in a bed, a being of otherworldly physiology, but crucially not dead, drawing the separation between the Night Lord and the infant much clearer. In the final moments, the Recluse holds the infant and for the first time offers it love, rather than scientific intrigue and as a subject to be studied, or in Hailster's case, misused to bring upon a new era of the dark. Moving from pretty morbid to entirely morbid is the story of the Revenant. We learn from her journal entries that the Revenant believes herself to be an aspect of a girl once named Daphne. Daphne was a younger member of an esteemed royal family who were vastly wealthy and influential figures and had built themselves a penchant for puppeteering. We know in the main game that puppeteers were not subjects for entertainment, but a force that could transfer and control the power of life force itself. So Luvus, the greatest puppeteer we can meet in the main game, even drawing aspiration in controlling the soul of the Empyrean demigod Rani. On the topic of Rani too, we know she was able to transfer her soul upon a doll of the Snow Witch. During her time in the game, she is in a consistent battle to understand who she truly was, and as the game progresses and as evidenced in entry 2 of her journal, she begins to recount her memories, proclaiming herself as Daphne. However, aided to her memories by the Recluse, she is able to relive the true moments of her past, taking us to her main story sequence. In this sequence, we learn one day the estate would be ravaged by a storm, the storm later known as the Nightreign itself. While initially we are inferred it was the corrosive nature of the Nightreign that would kill Daphne and her family, we learn at the end of her questline it was in fact an individual who would slaughter them all. However, it's inferred this individual was in fact spurred to madness by the Nightreign, which explains the Revenant's antagonisms towards the Night Lord rather than the maddened individual. It's clear too in the final fight sequence to enter the cutscene, this man is represented as a being called the Contaminant, once again affirming this maddened act of barbarism was acted out by a being who was contaminated by the Nightreign. Returning to the slaughter cutscene, we find the real Daphne sitting beside a doll, sharing the likeness of the Revenant. Eventually, as Daphne is found by the contaminated individual, he murders her in cold blood, leaving her face to face with the doll in question. After this cutscene, we get a final journal entry sharing the Revenant's key enlightenment. She was never Daphne, nor does she host Daphne's soul within her. She tells us, "The daughter of the house is no more. She will never caress my face again, no matter how much I yearn. I was never human, and now the mantle of doll no longer fits me," suggesting she was always Daphne's doll, and as we know Daphne's royal house was host to a family who knew puppetry well, it's likely Daphne was always somewhat sentient, and upon witnessing the brutal death of her caretaker Daphne, she would enter the Round Table hold, ready to avenge her death by destroying the Night Lord that condemned the world to the Nightreign itself. Changing pace quite dramatically, we have the hearty story of the Raider. We are told the Raider was from a place known as the Coastal Waters, a place where pirates thrived and belligerent warfare was commonplace. These lands favoured the strong, and the celebration of strength underpinned their cultural norms. Becoming an incredibly fierce fighter and even holding apprentices such as that of Weathervane that looked up to him as a tutor, the Raider, naturally having overcome a vast majority of challenges, would seek the greatest challenge of them all in the contemporary world, this being the challenges that lay within the lands between. Upon making the journey here, the Raider is made accustomed to the Tourney Between, a gladiatorial competition that sought to bring the greatest warriors to face off against one another. Naturally, we know this custom pays homage to the great colosseums once erected by Godfrey during Marika's first reign. In this age, Godfrey used pure strength to unify the entirety of the lands between, proclaiming the adage, "Might makes right," and thus the greatest figures are great only in the power that they held. Upon this, he would create the Colosseums, proving grounds for all beings within the lands between to not only battle amongst each other, but also as a platform for redemption to those condemned as villains under Marika's new reign. Many of those that were redeemed by the Proving Grounds would be known as the Duelists, carrying motifs of snakes on their head to demonstrate their history as sinners against the lands between, but often granted repatriation upon victory. Despite the turmoil since the days of Godfrey, the Colosseums persisted, and so did its greatest contest, and what the Iron Menial calls the Tourney. Raider is quick to take on each challenge, taking down one champion after the other, and even battling the champion duelists from the age of Godfrey. As the Raider comes to the end of his quest sequence, he is to duel his final opponent, only to find his final opponent hasn't shown up. However, from his journal entry, it's clear the Raider knew exactly who his final opponent was to be, someone who he knew was always going to be the final challenge and the real reason he came to the lands between. In his 7th journal entry, we are told of a story where the raider once known as the Black Claw was to meet a champion known as the Whitehorn at the coastal waters of his homeland, only to realise Whitehorn had left his helmet on the seaside and likely set off to the lands between. Adorning the Whitehorn's helmet, he sailed to the lands between to settle the battle for good, knowing they would lock horns in due time. Upon entering the lands between, he knew Whitehorn was not cowardly fleeing away from him, rather awaited raider for a duel in the great tourney of the lands between, a place where their fight would be memorialized forever. The two greatest pirates of the coastal waters battling in the home of the gods themselves. This would eventually spur the raider to the coastal waters of the lands between, where he would, just as promised, encounter the Whitehorn for their final duel. A battle that would play out as strategic, confident, fierce, and ultimately an exertion of pure rage, only to end in pure admiration. When Raider is done having defeated his final greatest foe, he becomes the new champion of the Colosseums, and the greatest pirate of the coastal waters, finally returning Whitehorn's helmet and garbs, and ending his sequence. We learn quickly from the interactions between the Executor and the Guardian that he hails from a time familiar with the Erdtree and the lands between, having witnessed its splendour himself. I also want to clear up a common misconception around the Executor's name. An Executor is not an executioner. An Executor is most commonly used to describe someone responsible for maintaining records and dealing with the affairs of a person or entity after their passing or dissolution. You have probably all heard this in your own lives in reference to an executor of someone's will. Many in the community have mixed this up with executioner, someone who is responsible for enacting capital punishment or lawful killings. However, this isn't to say he isn't an executioner as well. We'll go into this in more detail soon. We're told he believes himself to originate from the land of reeds, a place known for their famous sword technique akin to samurais in our own world, represented as a mastery of katanas. The land of reeds was infamous for their consistent civil wars, as tribal warfare was commonplace. However, the Executor was clearly not the same as all others from the Land of Reeds, as he wasn't human. In fact, he was a Crucible Knight. We only ever hear of Crucible Knights hailing from the Age of Plenty, associated with Marika's first reign and Godfrey's great unification of the lands between. We're told beside all other races, the Crucible Knights were the most fiercely loyal to Godfrey and represented his greatest show of force during this campaign. We're told one day, much after the lands were unified and the Crucible Knights decorated as champions of Marika's order, Marika would condemn all aspects of the Crucible as antithetical to a new order under her new union with Radagon. We learn the Erdtree during Godfrey's age was far more organic and may have actually grown from the Crucible itself, and thus in her new age she would tear from the Erdtree its Crucible traits, and in their place grew a golden illusory substitute, the discarded portion becoming the Shadow Tree, the literal shadow of the golden Erdtree. What's important here is that the Crucible Knights would also be forcefully ejected from the lands between, their position as decorated and graced knights torn from them. Godfrey, who was also duly exiled as a tarnished consort, would leave the lands between to return to his homeland, and many Crucible Knights would be condemned to wander the peripheries of the lands between. However, even despite their tarnished state, they peered upon Marika's order just as Godfrey would, in reverence. This is why Godfrey returns to defend the Erdtree in the main game, and why many Crucible Knights can be found protecting the roots of the Erdtree too. This may also explain why the Executor refers to himself as both a guest and a witness. Hailing from the Land of Reeds and fighting beside Godfrey during the Unification Wars was always a temporary place in the Golden Order, and he feels grateful he was able to help in its construction, but also witness its magnificence when many others could only be told of it. However, one day the Executor in his past life would either be tasked or driven to murder an innocent maiden. This act would have him commit seppuku, ritual self-destruction burdened with guilt and seeking redemption in honourable death alone, ending his past life. Of course, things are seldom that easy, for the Executor would be reborn anew to fight a new fight, the battle to end the Nightreign as a Nightfarer. It's likely having been reborn anew and witnessing a world absent of the Erdtree, he would build a deep guilt within him, realising the Erdtree had fallen in his absence. He begins to feel a sense of guilt that he preemptively ended his own life and thus was unable to protect the Golden Order during the Shattering War. This is precisely why he is referred to as the Executor. He takes on the burden of the Golden Order after it has gone, and duties himself with its post-mortem affairs. His quest has him painting the Erdtree from memory alone, and as we uncover his memories, the painting gets clearer. In his final sequence, he gets to reconcile his entire past and his present guilt, facing off against himself, a representation of his former life. If defeated, he is brought to an audience with the final moments of his past life where he enacts seppuku. In this moment, he acknowledges his past flaws, moving past them and amending for these actions by defeating the Night Lord. And while his life will end when the Night Lord is defeated, in his final moments he is able to find a golden sprout of the Erdtree, reassuring him his actions may be responsible for the Erdtree to once again grow anew, ending his sequence entirely. And also ending this list too. Thanks for watching, guys. While this video only details the main story of each Nightfarer, there is a whole load of more information entering the game regarding the nature of the Nightreign and even the lore around each boss, so watch out for those videos to come out very soon. Until then, I hope you guys enjoyed the video and I will be seeing you guys very, very soon.